my neighbors were asking me about, like, oh, heard that trees talk to each other. And it was just like, they're warning each other through fungi. And, and I was like, what? One thing that's puzzled me a lot about this Wood Wide Web sort of mother tree story is this need to make different organisms similar to us to care about them. If the story makes us care about forests more and conserve forests, why are you doing this? For me, my first response was just always because it's the truth. Don't you want to know the truth? And yeah, as a scientist, we can't pick and choose what are the good stories and the bad stories. That's sort of not our job. It's a slippery slope to look to nature as examples for our morality and ethics. How do we make a better world? Freedom to be creative, freedom to learn, freedom to be curious.
Good morning, Justine. How are you?
Hi, Jamie. I'm doing well. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's morning for you and you're drinking your coffee and it's a bit too late in the day for me and I'm now on my fifth coffee. So I will make it my last one, but we have a synchronicity across the time zones at the very least. Yeah.
A caffeine synchronicity. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good start. I first came across your work actually listening to you on the Many Minds podcast, and it was an absolutely fascinating story. And I thought it'd be brilliant to bring you on to Sentientism because I think you've been a central figure in a really fascinating case study about, the central topics to this podcast, really that question of epistemology through your involvement in this concept that's come to be thought of as the Wood Wide Web and, what that might mean and how well evidenced it is and so on. So I thought it would be a fascinating case study to explore because it links two of our big themes, those of epistemology and how do we understand the world, but also our values and ethics and how the two can relate. So I'm really looking forward to diving into that with you. But as I've explained more broadly, this is a Sentientism podcast is focused on what I think of as some of the deepest philosophical questions. And they are those questions of, epistemology, what's real, how do we understand the universe best? And just as importantly, the questions of ethics and morality and values. And critically, this question about who matters when we're doing ethics, which is a question I think is often neglected or the answer is assumed. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize Sentientism as a really broad, pluralistic, simple but radical worldview, which in a sentence I summarize as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So it takes a naturalistic, evidence-based approach to trying to understand the world, hopefully with a healthy dose of humility and open-mindedness. And on the ethical side, it's quite pluralistic, but it does insist that every sentient being, any being that can have the capacity to have experiences, to feel, to suffer, for example, should matter seriously in our moral consideration. But I'm very lucky in these conversations to talk to an enormous variety of different minds, some of whom agree and some of whom disagree. So it would be great to explore a bit of your philosophical journey, but then center on that, epistemological case study, I guess.
Yeah, no, great. There's a lot of intersections, I think, with my research, with this story, and yeah, a lot of the questions that you mentioned. So it'll be a great conversation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, looking forward to it. So before we get on to those big questions in that story, how would you best, I guess, introduce yourself and cue the topic up?
Yeah, well, hi, everyone. My name is Justine Karst. I'm an associate professor at the University of Alberta, which is in Canada. I would say I'm a forest ecologist with a focus on mycorrhizal fungi that grow on roots of trees. They tend to be beneficial for the tree. And I'm also the current president of the International Mycorrhiza Society. So yeah, so obviously I'm pretty into mycorrhizas. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You're the person to come to. Yeah. That's great. Thank you. So let's start with the first of these big philosophical questions, the question about what's real. And I guess we're going to dive into this in your professional work because it almost goes without saying that in this world of science, there is a naturalistic approach to understanding the world. And so before we get into that, I guess I was interested in your personal journey as well, because many people who take a naturalistic approach in a scientific context don't necessarily do the same thing in their personal lives as well. So I was sort of interested in your journey, even as a kid until now, into how you were brought up to think about some of those big, deep questions. And often that is a question for my guests about whether they grew up in a religious context, whether they're still religious now, or how that side of their life has shifted, and whether it ties in with the approach they apply to professional science, or whether it's a separate sort of reserved area today. But I don't know if you want to tell that story before we get into the
that's such
stuff.
a good question. So, okay, back to the beginning. My parents were both raised Catholic, but they both left the church when they got married, and we were raised in a non-religious home, but we would go out to see our grandparents every summer and spend weeks with them at a time. And there, I think on both sides, our grandparents felt like we need to get a healthy dose of religion because we were missing it from, all the other months of the year. So I still had a lot of contact, I guess, with it growing up. And I still am a very, very curious kid. And I guess what always struck me when we went to church with my grandparents was, like, I was really fascinated by a lot of the stories and kind of the rituals. But what I had trouble with was there was no time for asking questions. And that part always, so after church or after service, that would be the time that I could ask my grandparents questions. And when I got to be a little bit older, they would ask me a little bit more questions about how I felt about the service or what I thought about it today. So there was a bit more of an exchange there. But yeah, it was maybe I would have got more traction in it if there was more of an opportunity to ask questions. And the stories, especially from the Bible, some of them are extraordinary and they don't always make sense to a kid's mind or to an adult's mind. And so I just had lots of questions about that. And I think too, so my dad, he is definitely sort of the Spock in the family. My mom, she is an artist. And so, there are two very kind of different ways of thinking that I was brought up in the house. And so I'm probably kind of a blend of each of those. But I just, when I would say visit my cousins and they were, religious, most of them, but it would come up, this idea of God and where people came from and how we were evolved or not. And I remember one time, this is sort of a silly story, but I got into an argument with my cousin because we were talking about evolution. And so, and he was not for it at the time. And then we started talking about He-Man. Do you know that character He-Man?
Yeah.
Do you remember? Okay, so...
Yeah. He-Man and She-Ra, wasn't it?
Yes,
I think. Yeah,
yes. So he was trying to argue with me that He-Man has more muscles than I do. And I said, no, he has the same number of muscles as me, but they're just more developed. And that's what makes him stronger. And then, we got into a real argument about this. And then it went into where humans came from. And then I said, well, we've evolved from something like ape-like. And, we're 10 years old. And then I remember my grandma catching wind of this conversation and I got in trouble and just no more conversations like that. So
dangerous ideas.
Yeah. And so, so that was really frustrating for me. And that was sort of my growing up experience with religion. But I have to say that I'm not somebody that ever talks somebody out of their faith. I'm not anti-religion. I deeply respect, people's values and beliefs and faith, even though it's different than mine. I find it very easy to coexist with people who do have a faith. I remember my supervisor from my PhD, his son was a pastor, and I would love it when he came into the lab because he would just very patiently and entertain all my questions. And, we'd have these really good conversations about, he was more a proponent of nature, and you can see God's signature in nature and, and how much you can learn about God from studying nature. And I kind of wrestled with that, but it was more that I just really appreciated how much he would give me space to ask questions. And so, yeah, so I guess I'm not religious. I don't believe there's a God, but I am totally open to being wrong about that.
Yeah. And in a way, I think that's the right naturalistic stance, because if you really commit to doing evidence and reason properly, you should remain open-minded about even weird ideas and still grant a little bit of credence space, right? So that there's at least a chink of the door open. And if the evidence changes, you should change your mind, right? And quite often people who are, proud rationalist skeptics, with a naturalistic epistemology, sort of turn away from that and almost adopt their own dogmatism, whether it is about, there is no God or a particular stance, as if science has proclaimed the final dogmatic answer and the book is shut. And it's like, that's not what I think, good naturalistic epistemology is about at all. There's always questioning and uncertainty and openness.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to sort of stay humble about that. Like, I would say I practice science with the small s. I don't do science with a big S, if you kind of get what I mean there. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's an interesting mix in the way you describe that too, because there's sort of philosophical terminology, and I'm not a philosopher myself, but there's almost a distinction between the beliefs you might have, the ontology, the list of stuff you believe, and the epistemology, which is more like the toolkit that you use to work stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for some people, some of my guests are still religious. Some have left religion and become spiritual, but not religious. Some have changed religion. But there has been the canonical thing is a journey from a religious upbringing to a broadly naturalistic way of understanding the world. And that's certainly mine. It's boring becoming an atheist as a 13-year-old. And pretty much sticking with that since.
Yeah. Yeah. But I have to say, I mean, I'm still, when it comes to research, I am someone who loves an elegant experiment tied to field observations. Like, that's what I'm here for. But on the flip side, some people could say that I'm a reductionist because of that. And, and reductionist is kind of a dirty word. But I can live with it. And I think that to do research, it takes a lot of different approaches. And it so happens, I really love experiments, but again, always tied to field observations.
And I think that diversity of approaches, again, is part of a naturalistic approach. It isn't just, here's one procedure, which is big S science, and we follow it to the end. It's that, it is that diversity of approaches and perspectives, I guess, that makes it healthy.
Yeah. But, like everyone else, well, I don't know, I shouldn't say like everyone else. But, there's definitely been some events in my life that do make me pause and like, is there something more going on here? Like, what? And and I don't know how to explain them. I mean, I guess the like very rational thing would be, just these supreme coincidences that happen, right? And maybe you shouldn't read too much into them. But I think like many people, though, it does sort of kind of make you pause. And I guess because of that, that's one reason why I am not here to argue with someone about abandoning their faith or taking up a faith. Like, I just think it's a very personal, it's between you and whatever is out there, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. And it also felt like your experience of religion was more about the epistemology than the specific beliefs. It wasn't so much that you were saying, I don't think the evidence stacks up about whether there was a God or not. Your frustration more was about the fact that you liked asking open questions and exploring. And I guess the sense was, and this is the interesting thing, in many religious communities and cultures, there is actually a culture of questioning and, challenge. But even that is still ultimately done within a fairly set framework that is, supposed to be somewhat unquestionable. Whereas, you, as a kid, and it's a classic kid thing to do, and I wish adults held onto it, that, open questioning and that living with the uncertainty is the epistemological frustration. And some people, when I talk about sentientism, I say, well, part of it is this naturalistic epistemology, using evidence and reason to understand the world and, set your credences. Some people say, well, what other alternatives are there? They almost can't compute that there is a different way. I mean, what else would you do apart from using information about reality to understand reality? So I do say, well, there are alternatives that most people around the world do use today in at least some parts of their lives to ground their credences and beliefs. And they do include faith or fideism, revelation. And by that, I mean, a sort of revelation that is unchallenged by any other evidence, right? Because in a way, our personal experiences are types of revelation, but we should be skeptical of them because we're evolved apes. So we don't take a personal experience or of a coincidence as 100% the final answer, right? We look for other sources and corroborate. And the same with authority, right? We, even good naturalists use sources of authority, but they're never unquestioned or unchallengeable. And we don't take a dogmatic approach either, where you sort of pick a belief and it will never be changed by evidence. So, I do see those as distinct alternatives to a naturalistic approach that ultimately I think are very unlikely to help us understand the world well, because to a degree they seem almost by definition arbitrary, because if they're not grounded in information from reality, what are they based on? And there must be some, either an arbitrary route or a route that is more to do with human social norms or psychology and so on. But I should stop rambling on, because part of the reason I was really interested in your story that we should come on to now is because it's not enough to just say, okay, well, I reject dogmatism and fideism and, revelation and authority, and I commit to a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason, because that can be done well and it can be done badly too. So just saying, well, I'm going to take a naturalistic, broadly scientific approach to the world by no means guarantees you will understand things. And like I say, you can do those things in good or bad ways too. So I wondered if that might be a good way to queue up the story of the Wood Wide Web. And many of my guests might have heard of the idea, because that's part of our discussion now, is because it's become part of the zeitgeist. But I don't know if you want to just sort of walk us through the story about how that sort of cluster of memes and those ideas came to be from the science and then in the culture, and how you've come to think about it now. Just sort of take us through the journey.
Yeah. I was thinking before that, one of the things you mentioned, so this naturalistic approach and with science, it could have some failings. I do think that the overall process is robust, but it breaks down because humans are involved. I think that's, like if you step back, it's a pretty good framework. It's just that we humans are the agents in it, and we have some flaws. I think it's like that. But anyways.
Some people also, I think, equate a naturalistic epistemology with science, as if science is the only way of doing naturalism. And when I do quite a lot of workshops with kids in classrooms about worldviews in general and epistemology, but one of the things I will say to them is that, science is a particular formal way of doing a naturalistic epistemology, but it's not the only one, right? I'm here with you on a Zoom call, and I have a very high credence that you exist and we are on a Zoom call together, and I haven't really done any science. I'm using my senses, I'm using my personal experience, my life history. Those are types of evidence too. And we should be skeptical of those types of evidence, but it's not just people like you in lab coats or, digging in the forest. It can be broader than science. If it's a good faith, using information from reality to try and understand it with humility, I think that counts as a broader sort of naturalism than just a formal scientific process. But
yeah. No, that's a good point. Okay. Wood Wide Web.
Yeah, let's just tell the story. And I mean, and I'm so aware of how much depth we could go into here, and I'd love to dig into as much as you're comfortable with. But yeah, just maybe paint the broad story of how it's played out over time.
Yeah. Okay. So the Wood Wide Web, that label, that name, so that came to be about 25 years ago, and it emerged from an experiment that was published in Nature. And so Suzanne Simard led that experiment. There was a number of other people, including my PhD supervisor, Melanie Jones. And this experiment was groundbreaking for a number of reasons. Like, many of us were super excited about this experiment. So it was set up in a cleared forest. It was some seedlings planted together. One of the seedlings was labeled with carbon dioxide so you could track where the carbon ended up. And they showed that this label, this carbon, went into a nearby seedling that had the same mycorrhizal fungi as the labeled seedling. And then they had this other seedling that did not form the same kind of mycorrhizal fungal associations, and it received considerably less carbon.
And can you just briefly explain what the mycorrhizal fungi are? I think many people will be familiar with it, but
Yeah. So mycorrhizal fungi, they're fungi that grow in or around the little tiny root tips of plants. So most plants form these associations with mycorrhizal fungi. It's a very sort of ancient relationship. We think it came to be about 400 or 500 million years ago, so it's very ancient. And mycorrhizal fungi, because they can be sort of generalists sometimes, so they can form associations with one tree species and another tree species, that they can link the true trees below ground, like a physical connection. And that's in itself is super interesting because you have one organism that's in a totally different kingdom than plants, but then is joining them underground. And so there's been a lot of interest in like what is going on.
Because like you say, if you look on the classic tree of life things, that is a super distant cousin, right? I mean,
It
it's a
is,
long way
yeah.
away, completely different kingdom.
They're very different. I mean, there's this claim, this statement that's thrown up, that's true, is that fungi are more closely related to us than they are to plants. Just to give you a sense of like the sort of divergence we're talking about. So this fungus is connecting plants of the same or different species, but two different individuals. And there's resources and stuff moving around in this fungi. And then based on this other kind of relationship between what we call microheterotrophic plants. So these are really, really neat associations. So you'll have, say, a plant that doesn't photosynthesize. It has mycorrhizal fungi colonizing its roots. And then that same mycorrhizal fungus will be colonizing roots of a photosynthesizing plant. And then the non-photosynthesizing plant is getting carbon through the fungus, and the fungus is getting carbon from that green plant. So it's like the clearest
Wow.
demonstration of a common mycorrhizal network. We've been fascinated by these things forever. But then the question is, well, okay, do we see that in other types of plant species that are, say, all photosynthesizing? So this field experiment, so it was a field experiment. They used a really, really novel technique to get at where the carbon was going and the net transfer between these two different species. And it got published in Nature, which is like, a very esteemed journal. And then and we've tried to trace back, nobody knows who this person was. They called it the Wood Wide Web. And then it quickly took off. And
So you don't even know if that was in the sort of scientific sphere or the journalist sphere, or you're not sure who coined it at all?
no, it would have been somebody who was working for Nature. So it would have been somebody, one of their employees, but no one seems to know who it was. So yeah, thank you to that person, whoever you are. It really took on. So that was 25 years ago. And so that paper generated a lot of interest, but some immediate backlash because there was a lot of questions about the techniques. Did they actually show carbon transfer? Did the carbon leave the fungus and go into the other plant? Was it leaking through the soil? There was a lot of questions, like technical questions about it. And then there was also some more like conceptual questions of like, well, why? So the fungus needs carbon. It can't get carbon from any other way besides plants. So given that it needs this carbon so badly, why would it give it up to another plant? So, there was a lot of questions about it right away. And there has been, a few experiments. Well, from our review, there's been less than 30 experiments done in the field on this topic. And no one has definitively shown that this carbon is moving through these, what we call common mycorrhizal networks. So it's been debated for 25 years. It's never been conclusive. Always a lot of uncertainty and questions around it. But then I guess about I don't know, I guess about 5 years ago or a bit longer, so there was that one book that came out by Peter Volobin, The Secret Life of Trees. It was talked about again in this book. And I remember I picked up this book and, everyone's like, oh, you need to read this book. You need to read this book, because I'm a forest ecologist. I picked it up and I didn't really care for it. It wasn't really for me. I found the language, what's the word? Like really kind of infantile, like, and just in terms of like how we were talking about trees. And I've never felt a need to anthropomorphize forests or trees to that extent to get me interested in what they're doing and why we should care about them.
Yeah, I mean, you're interested anyway, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's me. And so, I put the book down and didn't really think very much of it. But this book became like a super international bestseller all over the place. And I think for many scientists, we were a little bit surprised by that. And the way that it's written in this book, it's just that it kind of removed all the uncertainty and the debate and, hey, we never really got this figured out. And just to like trees talk to each other through these below ground fungi, and they're cooperating and they're recognizing their kin and they're saving each other and they're warning each other. So yeah. And it seemed to really, I think, resonate with a lot of people. And then there was a second book, Suzanne Simard's book, Finding the Mother Tree, and this was a very, it was a book that reflected, I think, very much on like her personal journey and her experience. And then woven into that was her research. And then by that time, my neighbors were asking me about like, oh, heard that trees talk to each other. And it was just like, they're warning each other through fungi. And, and I was like, what? And again, I haven't really paid attention to these books.
And what do you think made it catch on in the public imagination? You talked about anthropomorphization as a classic thing that humans do, sometimes appropriately and often not. What other aspects of the story just triggered aspects of people's psychology that just got them invested? What do you think were the other themes there?
I think that like there's always been this interest in fungi, but I think up until recently it was more fringe. And I think fungi, because of how they grow and how they exist, they're one of those organisms that are like here, there, everywhere. They're these networks for, mostly they're invisible under your feet.
Sort of mysterious.
Yeah, they're moving resources around. And so, like, I think they capture a lot of people's imaginations that way. They're like tremendous decomposers. So they live on that edge between life and death. I think for the trees that, you imagine these like towering, stoic figures reaching up to the sky, enduring all this stuff, environmental change around them, but yet they're like taking care of their families in a very sort of like quiet, unnoticed way. And I think that these themes really resonate with a lot of people. And I think too, some of this, like the emergence again of the Wood Wide Web also happened during COVID. And I think COVID was a time for many of us that we didn't have anywhere to go besides, being able to go walk out in the park and I think many people kind of maybe rediscovered or discovered nature for the first time. And then as these stories were coming out, it was a mirror of like a better world out there. Look what nature is doing. And
so I think there's quite a strong default sort of sense of awe and reverence for nature in the average human mind. But COVID almost just gave that a sort of super boost, right? The place you can't be at the moment, where you can't go is just, the reverence just steps up another notch. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, you mentioned this early, like many people have abandoned religion. Like in our generation, probably started with my parents' generation, they've abandoned it for all sorts of good and, maybe bad reasons. I don't know. And I think that there might be a little bit of a gap there. And so this reverence, this like nature religion, I think is sort of filling that gap maybe in a bit of an unscrutinized way. These are just all ideas. I don't know. Yeah.
I think you're definitely on something. And I find that in my conversations with many people, there's that sense of wanting something to connect with something that's bigger than yourself. And I don't just mean in a physical sense, right? That is transcendent, that is interconnected. I think almost everyone, I'm a very hard-edged naturalistic sort of person, but, I feel that pull too. So there's something there. How much do you think there's also, so some of the other fascinating parts of the human psychology toolkit are a very active agency detection. It's the usual story that's told is, if there were two early humans in the savannah and, you see something glinting in the bushes, if one of them thinks it's probably nothing, they get eaten. And if the other one thinks it's probably a tiger, they survive, right? So there's an evolutionary story there about, why we might have advanced agency detection to pick up threats. And that can play into some ideas about religion or demons or spirits or animism and, wanting to see trees as beings in some sense. And that also links to, I guess, the concept of teleology as well. This idea that people want to think, there's a goal or a purpose or an end that things are steering towards, and they can go together in the sense that, if you think, well, maybe the forest is almost like an agent, or the trees are agents, and they have goals. They are trying to help each other and communicate, and they're acting together. There's a purpose behind this as well. So there seems to be something about agency and teleology that maybe was part of this story as well.
Yeah, I think so. And what's interesting to me, though, is that most of the discussion, it's anchored in forests. And, and definitely when I walk through a forest, I have certain feelings like, there's so much life right in front of your eyes. The trees are tall. It makes you look up. The humidity and everything in the forest. There's lots of sensations there. It's hard, well, for me anyways, not to feel like, I'm in and part of nature in a forest. And as a child, I grew up in a remote part of the forest. And so it's a very comfortable place for me. But then but nature is everywhere in all forms of ecosystems. So, this discussion is centered around forests, but I would then, think about when I go into the grasslands. So, we're just on the edge of the prairies where I am, and the vegetation and plants there are quite small compared to trees, right? It's like, a foot or two high. There's tremendous diversity, but it tends to be, you're looking down and it's very concentrated. But the sky is huge. And there I have different feelings, and it's often windy. And so, you're standing there, it's windy, you're in this huge sky, and it's hard. Sometimes I'm like, who am I? Am I the wind? It's a very different feeling when I'm in that ecosystem. And then compared to, say, when I'm on the ocean, I feel like a foreign body on the ocean. I do not feel connected to that landscape. I feel like I'm in the wrong place. I feel kind of scared. I feel alone. I have very different feelings. So I'm one person, and that's three landscapes. And if you took someone else, I'm pretty sure they'd have very different feelings as well. And all of this, and these feelings are important. It connects us to landscapes and, and that, and I don't want to trivialize that. But none of this changes or informs how nature works. None of it. It's all like feelings, but it doesn't change how nature works. And I think it's like we also have to be very cautious about using those feelings we have in nature than to say, this is how the world works. Like, so for example, when I'm in the forest, I feel very connected. I walk out, okay, the world is connected. I'm in the ocean on my little boat. I feel alone. I feel totally abandoned. This world is a terrible place. We're all disconnected individual entities.
What's down there?
Exactly. It's scary. And so, it's a simple example, but it's like, I think one that clearly shows that, yeah, we have to be very cautious about looking to what we project on nature, because let's face it, like everything you were just talking about, agency, these teleological arguments, like it's all massive projections of us on what we hope nature to be like. Nature doesn't care. It is what it is, and it always will be what it is. And we will always project, I think, on nature. But if we can be more aware that that's what we're doing, I think it would be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd argue that that's part of the psychology of religion, and that we're almost projecting humanity onto an imagined deity, right? I mean, the deities described in the religious books are remarkably familiar to anyone who can, understand what a medieval powerful man was like. So, but so we've touched on some of the themes that made the idea of the Wood Wide Web just resonate in the popular culture and just sort of take off and go out into the memeplex, and that's really helpful. But it's not just the public and popular culture. Journalists are humans too, and scientists are humans too. So to what degree do you think that the journalists doing the science communications and the interpretation and writing books, and even the scientists themselves, were affected by this sort of vibe and energy and excitement? I mean, how much was that a factor too, or was it just a naive public taking things the wrong way after having read a Nature article?
No, it was definitely, it infiltrated all of us, I would say, and I think as part of being a scientist too, it's like, I call myself a scientist, but I mean, I'm a member of the public as well. And I am vulnerable to all the same shortcuts in thinking and everything else that everyone else is.
You are also a human being. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, we have strategies in place to try to minimize that. Our work has to go through peer review. I'm someone that I really enjoy working with people that don't agree with me. And, as long as we're arguing to unpack ideas and not necessarily to be right, I learned so much from those opportunities. So scientists are not immune to what happened to the public. I think also the reason that it took off so much with the public is initially, I don't think journalists were asking enough questions. I think that this story was just I've heard it been described as narrative gold. It was just so good. And why would you ask any questions? So
I had, as a tangent, I had a fascinating conversation with Aaron Stibbe, who's a eco-linguist. And this is exactly what he focuses on, is understanding language, narrative stories, and, doing deep analysis of all sorts of text, right? It could be a men's health article or a scientific journal or a newspaper headline. It could be almost anything. But the power of narrative on the human mind is mind-blowing. So for you to describe it as narrative gold, that resonates.
We just can't
ticks
resist.
Every box.
Yeah, it does. So I think, so journalists were not asking enough questions. And so then it's this beautiful idea then was legitimized by science with a capital S. And so then I think it gave people even more of a not only is the story wonderful, but it's totally supported by science. So then it just ticks off more boxes, right? So that was a problem. But the other thing is we have evidence that as scientists, we were caught up in this story as well. So when we wrote our review, we also looked at how scientists were citing the original literature on this topic. And what we found is that when we look at the most, our most current year, I think it was 2023 or something when we did this. And at that point, 45% of papers that were citing the original papers on this topic were making unsubstantiated claims. And they weren't just kind of random mistakes. They were directional in that the kinds of statements people were putting in today's papers, they promoted this idea of the Wood Wide Web. They promoted the idea that resources were moving around, forests were more resilient. These mycorrhizal networks, they're everywhere, and all trees in a forest are connected. So it was a directional bias in the literature that promoted these ideas. And so we scientists, we were vectors in this misleading story as well. And I think, and that part was a surprise for us when we wrote the paper, but also going through it, I mean, I had to go and revisit some of my papers and how I cited the original work. And I was making some misleading statements as well. I mean, I wouldn't say the misleading as in like I knowingly was trying to mislead the public, but it was like I was also caught up in this, and just like I thought in my mind that the evidence was more certain and conclusive than it actually was. And then when we went back to look at these original studies, and oftentimes in the discussion, people were, frank about here are the caveats, here are what we don't know, here are the limitations. But that didn't get carried forward. It kind of got ignored, and just the beautiful story got caught. That's what moved forward. So
in each iteration, the caveats and the uncertainties sort of being left to one side, and the narrative gold, continues through. Was there also a degree to which even the scientists were sort of picking up some of the narrative from the journalism and
I think
bringing
so.
that back into the science as well? Was that it was actually?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think that there was definitely some reinforcement going on between the two communities, because we, many of us read like sort of science journalism. And if you're reading that, especially when it's in like, the New York Times and like big media outlets, there's some beautiful documentaries, fantastic fungi, filming is gorgeous. It just sucks you in. And so I think that there definitely was some reinforcement there. And I think for some of us, it's just that the story just got to be so extraordinary. These mother trees, before they die, they send their wisdom to their seedlings through the mycorrhizal network. Like, it's just extraordinary. And I'm a little bit embarrassed how far it had to go before I was like, I don't know about this.
So what was that? So what was that next stage like? Why didn't you just go with the flow and keep enjoying it and keep mining the narrative goal? What happened next? How did you come to write the review? And what is the state of, the state of the art of the reality of these networks? And
yeah, so the review, it actually was not, we didn't start the review to debunk any of these claims. So as I mentioned, so Melanie Jones, she was on that original paper 25 years ago about the carbon transfer and ended up in Nature. And Melanie, she was about to retire that year. And so, I was talking to her, I was like, Melanie, it'd be such a good idea. We should do a review and like look back in 25 years and where's the field at? And so that's what she and I were thinking about. And then,
so it wasn't an adversarial science type thing where you're like, we're going to take these people down because you were the people, right? Yeah.
No, not at all. And then when I was talking to my friend Jason Hooksma, so he was the third person on that review, he was more aware of these popular claims. Melanie and I don't think really had much idea, maybe hearing a little bit and like, whoa. And then
you didn't realize quite how far it had gone. Yeah.
No. And Jason had a better idea. And he was thinking he was just not on top of the literature, and that given these claims, these extraordinary claims, we surely were missing some really important papers. And so we've also felt as scientists like, okay, this is our topic area of research. We should really be on top of the literature. So it came from like a very different place, and then it ended sort of in this dark place. And so by the time that we'd gone through the literature and assessed these like wild claims, it was really disappointing. And for me, it was disappointing, and it was like kind of frustrating and in a way kind of sad. This story that I grew up with in my career, it was sort of this house of cards, and it was sad. Like, yeah, it was hard. And it was like, but it was really eye-opening for me because it just made me realize that as a scientist, my job is not to be a parrot. I'm not here to be a parrot of someone else's results and their outcomes and their studies. I need to have the time to really dig in and decide for myself, like, do I think the evidence is strong? Do I think they're testing that question? Are there alternative explanations? And that is really my job. And that became very clear to me after doing this review that I needed to do my job better.
Yeah. And how would you, I mean, and it sounds like just for you, that was a sort of psychologically challenging thing to go through, because you invested so much in this field and in the direction, and there was excitement, and you're sort of raining on your own parade in a way.
Oh, I felt like I was like killing Christmas for everybody. Like,
yeah. And what sort of response did you get from others in the field and the people who'd written books about this, or even from the wider public? Are they just like, why are you being such a killjoy? What sort of response did you get? Because again, one of the things we touch on a lot in this podcast is the power of social norms, like very easily drive us away from truth and good values. So
yeah. So
was it difficult?
I would say from the research community, it was mostly positive. I guess I didn't realize at the time, but there were a number of people that were getting uncomfortable with this like story, this really popular story. And so I think for many of us, it was a bit of a sigh of relief that someone finally tackled it and just like, oh yeah,
Burst
we
the
need to
bubble
get
of it.
this back on track. Yeah, we need to get back on track here. So that's the research community, but not all, not all. And then there was the public, and that was definitely a lot messier. There was some people that had very strong feelings, so strong that they had to email me about it. But in one way or another, many have very strong feelings of like, what I had done was terrible. I was, the equivalent of a climate change denier. So some pretty terrible responses. But then there were lots of like really good responses too, in terms of like, yeah, this is the process of science, the self-correction, like, good job. So there was that. And then there was also, I think, a pretty major component though of, in this, I would say, falls in the research community, public, media, everyone, that there was a question of like, yeah, but if the story makes us like care about forests more and conserve forests, like, why are you doing this? And
yeah, it's like the noble lie idea is
exactly. And, and I had to think about that a lot too. I mean, for me, my first response was just always like, because it's the truth. Like, and I was really puzzled. Like, I don't understand the question. Like, it's the truth. Don't you want to know the truth? Like, and so I had to, really kind of sit in that for a while. And as a scientist, like, we can't pick and choose what are the good stories and the bad stories. Like, that's sort of not our job. The more that we do this, like, well, we really like this story, so here's a bunch of evidence to prop it up, even though it's misleading. When it comes to like saying, a story that's not so heartwarming, and then if we're like, oh, here's a bunch of evidence to take it down, I mean, it just totally undermines our credibility completely. And there's already, I think, a loss of the public's trust in science, and this deeply, deeply worries me. And so, so I think that part of just like the goal, the purpose, I think many people sort of struggled with that part, because it did, I think, for some people who were really interested in forest conservation and protection, we just removed a really powerful pillar in their arguments for conservation. And I don't know what to say about it.
Take some bravery as well, yeah. And how would you? This is a really tough question. How would you summarize post your review the current state of knowledge about these common mycorrhizal networks.
Yeah, no, it's actually quite simple to summarize.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I think most of us in the research community all agree that trees and plants can be connected below ground through these mycorrhizal fungi. Done. How these networks
Which is amazing
function,
in its own right. I mean,
I know, that's what I'm like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
How these networks function, we don't know. We don't know. And it will take more research and studies to figure that out. There's a lot of unanswered questions. There's a lot of good experiments out there, and some of them already point to that trees or seedlings don't need to be connected to these mycorrhizal networks to have this little bit of carbon that, flows below ground. We do know that there's potentially a wide range of responses of seedlings to connecting into these mycorrhizal networks. That much we can say. It's like, we can say something more definitive, I should say, about the structure in terms of plants are probably connected below ground. But is it function like an internet? I'm going to say probably not. And even it's like there might be a couple trees here that are connected by one fungus. There might be some trees over here that are connected by a different kind of fungus. And I have a colleague, and he describes the structure more as a mosaic, not an internet. And I think he's probably right in that it is more of a mosaic. But even to say that, we need to do more studies and figure that out. So it's a topic with so much uncertainty. And I mean, as you probably know, like metaphors spring from areas of uncertainty. And, and it's a beautiful thing. Metaphors are a beautiful thing. But it just so happens that this one just got wildly out of hand.
Got a life of its own, yeah.
It really did, yeah.
Well, that's a fascinating story. Thank you. And I think we'll come back to it in a bit as well, because one of the things as you've talked us through that story that's really obvious is that there isn't really such a thing in human endeavor as a sort of pure epistemological effort to understand the truth. That work is always affected by values, and it also affects values in turn, right? There's always a cycle of our ethics and our values affecting the way we think and understand the world, and our understandings of the world, of course, shape our values as well. So you can see that richly running through the whole conversation. And really that's the second part of the second big philosophical question I like to posit in these conversations, which is about ethics and morality. And sometimes I ask, what matters, the sort of roots of ethics, if you like. And people might talk about justice or suffering or harm or fairness or dignity, or there's so many different things, or rights or utility. But maybe you can touch on that as much as you like. But the more interesting and more important question for me is who matters, whatever our ethics is. And there's a classic portfolio of choices you can take, if you like, where you might have anthropocentrism, which is focused on humans. There's where I am, or where sentientism, which is sentiocentrism, where every sentient being matters as a moral patient, a being of moral concern, which motivates my veganism as an example, as a practical implication. But you can go beyond into biocentrism, where all living entities, even if they're not sentient, should matter intrinsically. And even beyond that, into ecocentrism and holism, where people will say, well, look, even the non-living and non-sentient stuff should matter. Rocks, rivers, trees, ecosystems, concepts, cycles, processes, those things matter, not just because they impact sentient beings, but because they matter intrinsically, even if there were no sentient beings here at all. So there's that portfolio, if you like, from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism. And some people obviously go even narrower than anthropocentrism. We know the problems that leads to, where, only humans that I like or are like me or look like me or meet some criteria really count and the others don't, right? So there's the entire portfolio. Again, I'm interested in your philosophical journey about, even as a kid, how do you go through that process of thinking about, obviously the intuitive stuff about friends and family, and then broadening your moral scope, and have you gone through that journey so far? And how do you think about that question now about who actually gets to matter when we're thinking through moral questions?
Yeah. That's an interesting one, Jamie. So, and this actually kind of relates to the Wood Wide Web and how I've been thinking about it. And one thing that's puzzled me a lot about this wood wide web sort of mother tree story is this need to make different organisms similar to us to care about them. And I mean, that's ultimately the idea, I think, behind it. Like, you project families on trees, it makes them like us, therefore we should care about them.
On the assumption that if they're not like us, we won't care about them. Yeah.
Exactly. And taking it a step further, like, not only are trees, in families, but they also care about each other. And so the fact that they care about each other, we must then care about them. And I guess I have, for most of my life, been comfortable with deeply caring about nature and accepting it probably doesn't care about me. And
do you think it cares about itself?
do I think it cares about itself?
Do you think nature can care about anything?
Yeah. Well, it probably varies depending on which organism you're talking about, right? And I think that when we're thinking about like all organisms, I would say in some way care about their environment, right? Like they respond to the environment. So, you could call it caring or aware. I don't know what the right word is, but there's definitely a response to the environment. And oftentimes the environment is other organisms. So, and so I think, to some extent, yes, that nature is aware of other beings and its environment. So yes. But I guess like the other thing that I'm weighing in my mind is, as a kid who did grow up kind of in some remote forest, like, as much as there was life around me, there was death. Like, when you're kind of living close to the land, it's not you're trying to live, but to do that, you're often taking the lives of other organisms around you. And I guess, okay, I'm going to share one example that has really stuck with me for my whole entire life about my view of nature and what I think of it. So when I was a kid, I was probably about 10 years old, and we had some yard cats. And one of the cats, her name was Missy, and she was pregnant. And, we saw her for months, like running around and, getting bigger and bigger. And it was clear any day she was going to pop. And so in that day, I saw her, I went outside and I could hear her meowing, and I sat down and I was still in my pajamas. And the pajamas I was wearing was kind of like, a dress sort of thing. So when I sat with my legs crossed, there was like a little hammock there, And Missy, she crawled into my lap, and she was birthing her babies. And only when there was one kitten that she birthed, and it was dead. And my mom by that time had come out because we're all excited. Missy's having a baby on Justine's lap. Like, this was crazy. But the kitten was dead. And then the cat, she ate the dead kitten in my lap. And I was like, what? And I was looking at my mom like, should we be letting her do this? And, my mom is like, that's a lot of nutrients. And so, she's just taking them back. And when she's got those nutrients, she'll get pregnant again. And maybe next time the kitten will be alive. And that, and that was sort of the end of it. And I think I was young enough not to be completely grossed out by it. And again, because I was super curious, I was like, what is going on? But that life, death, and, I guess it's always really stuck with me. And so I definitely do not have a very like romantic view of nature, but I'm definitely somebody who, definitely cares about ecosystems. I don't care that trees are not like me to find them amazing and worth value. Nature is going to continue if humans are not on this planet. So in a way, to me, they already have intrinsic value. Like, we already know that about them, that, like, if we disappear, nature will be, I don't want to say mostly fine, because, there are a lot of ecosystems that have been stewarded by humans. And so, we've always played that role with nature. I don't know. Now I think I'm rambling, Jamie.
No, that's useful. That's really interesting. Thank you. And there's still some quite interesting areas of overlap, because personally, I take quite a strict sentientist stance. So the way I frame sentientism is that every sentient being has to matter, and has to matter seriously. So it's about including all the beings that can feel, that can experience, that can value things. It's not about saying we mustn't go further, or you mustn't include others. I'm most worried about excluding the sentient beings, like the cat on your lap, that can actually feel pain and can experience things, and so on. So it's more making sure we get our arms around the right people, rather than excluding, things that aren't sentient. But at the same time, I have a really rich environmental concern, but I guess it's a bit more instrumental than it is intrinsic. So if I think about the act of cutting the throat of a pig, I see that as a deep moral wrong, because the pig wants to live a long, happy life with their family and feels excruciating pain from what I've done. And because they value their state and that experience and their interest in living, for me to be moral, I have to care about that too. That's almost tautologically what morality has become for me, is considering the other, because they have their perspective, their interests and their perspectives. Now, if I go to cut a branch off a tree, I might see that as aesthetically damaging. I might see it would have knock-on impacts to maybe the birds that live in the tree. I might see it would have a problem because it limits the ability of the tree to sequester carbon, which might have knock-on impacts for the environment. So there's loads of other reasons why I would see that as a bad thing. But I don't think the tree is subjectively experiencing any pain or anything at all from me cutting the branch. So I see that as a radically different moral act from what someone might do to the pig. So this is why I guess I focus on sentience as the capacity to have an experience or an interest, so I guess what I mean is that I still have a really rich overlap with an ecocentrist or a biocentrist in actually caring about all of that stuff, but I care about it because of its impact on the sentient beings, whereas they might care about those things even in an imaginary world where there were no sentient beings at all. It's difficult to do, because who would be there to value those things? But anyway.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, and it sounds like you've found your place, like, how you exist and what's important and that morality. And I don't disagree with any of like what you said. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. It's interesting because it often comes down to, like, I think killing,
Yeah.
what's okay to kill and damage ultimately, right? And
or cause to suffer or exploit or
cause to
treat unjustly. I mean, there's lots of different perspectives here.
Yeah. And like, I also know, growing up, like, we had chickens, we had the yard cats and dogs and stuff. But, and my dad, he grew up on a farm, like raising cattle. We didn't have cattle as kids or anything, but there was definitely, if there was an animal, like sometimes not sometimes, cats would get a bird or something, right? And, the poor bird, and, and they're horrible because they play with the birds and just torment them and stuff, right? And if that was happening, my dad would be the one, like, kill the bird, put it out of its misery. Like, how, Justine, can you watch that? And, and I just hated that job. Like, but at the same time, my dad was just totally confused as, like, how could you possibly watch something that has feelings, like, and has a deep capacity to feel pain, like, suffer like that? And
it's hard.
It is, yeah. And so, and I guess it's like, and that's just like with a bird. There was many instances like that it's like, you're making these decisions. And so, yeah. And then it kind of goes back to, like, well, if the intent is noble, is it okay to kill, or is it just not? And
or if it's done in the best interest of the of the
Exactly.
other,
Like,
then in good faith, then that can be, I mean,
yeah,
that debate goes on even in our species, right?
yeah. Yes, exactly. No, that's a good, yeah, it goes on even in our species. And, and I think this is definitely a topic that needs a lot of care and thinking. And yeah,
Yeah, it's
it's
tricky.
it's a really important topic that needs just a lot of care and thinking, I would say.
It
Yeah.
is. And part of the frustration I find is that I'm quite comfortable people granting moral consideration to all the sentient beings, including in the wild, in our labs, in farms, in our homes, and then going beyond to say, and I also care intrinsically about trees and rocks and rivers and ecosystems. And I guess the frustration I have is that the default human stance today is to say they care really richly about the environment and rocks and rivers and trees and the earth as Gaia, while actually continuing to support the brutal objectification, commodification, exploitation, suffering and death and abuse of countless billions of very obviously sentient beings for no reason. So that's when the dissonance starts to fire in my head, because I'm like, you're claiming a really expansive moral consideration that goes beyond mine, right? You've gone beyond sentient, but you're excluding vast billions of the sentient beings as well. So that's partly my frustration, because I think one of the things that tends to happen, and this links to what we were talking about before, is because there is this romantic pull for the transcendence and a connection with nature and a sort of nature fallacy that nature is intrinsically good and wonderful, that leads people into what can sometimes be a bit of an ethical flattening where almost everything matters, so nothing really does. So, and the way it manifests itself, on Twitter as a mouthy vegan, tends to be something along the lines of, well, there's predation in the wild, so why can't I do that too? What if a lion can eat a gazelle, then why can't I eat a burger? Or also, and this is another area I'd love to dig into with you, is the place where the Wood Wide Web comes up most commonly for me is actually in talking about animal ethics and veganism. So there's all sorts of responses, right? Most are trolling or bad faith, and some are actually in good faith, right? And they're genuine inquiries or challenges, which is fine. And it can be a little bit difficult to tell which is which sometimes. But one of them often is, oh, but plants feel pain too, or trees are beings in their own right, and because these other things matter too, if a blade of grass matters, and a tree matters, and a pig matters, and a fish matters, well, I have to eat something, so I might as well have a Big Mac and a milkshake.
Yeah,
and I'm like,
yeah.
and my response to that is, are you saying it's morally equivalent to, kill a pig and cut a blade of grass? Are you genuinely saying that? But that is part of the zeitgeist.
That's part of it. Yeah.
And so there's almost this second story here, which links to the Wood Wide Web, but it's not the same. It is distinct, but it does link, which is this question about, it's less about challenging sentientism, because these people in a way are saying, no, I'm with you, I care about all sentient beings. But they're just saying that maybe plants are sentient too. Maybe the tree is a being that does actually feel, a leaf has dropped or my apple has ripened, and is experiencing those things as a being. Now, I think naturalistically we should be open-minded about that and follow the science wherever it leads. And even if that leads us to an uncomfortable conclusion that, yes, mowing your lawn is a moral travesty because you've just, cut lots of grass, we should follow it where it leads. I guess my stance at the moment, and I'd love your view, is that the way plants do respond to the environment is more analogous to, a ball rolling down a hill or a thermostat turning the heating on than it is to a being like you or me or a cat or a fish or a pig that is also having some form of subjective experience that values our state through a feeling of good or bad. So in the same way as you might say, oh, well, the ball is rolling down the hill, so the ball needs to roll down the hill. The ball wants to roll down the hill. The ball feels good as it rolls down the hill. I'm like, no, you don't need to know anything about the internal state of the ball to understand that, right? And I don't think plants are quite that simple, but I think they're closer to that than they are to you or me or a pig or a fish. But what do you think about that? Are plants actually sentient? Should they count as moral patients in that context? Can they feel, do you think?
Well, as far as I know, they don't have pain receptors. So I think we can we can wipe that off. But I think you're right in to sort of keep an open mind of, I know I just saw your little dog back there. Um,
Luna might come and introduce herself in a minute. Sorry, go.
that's okay. Like, but kind of leave an open mind of, what plants can do. Like we know, as I mentioned, they respond to all sorts of things, light, gravity, neighbors. We know that they can change their environment. And the question always is, are they doing this to achieve, some kind of goal? Because, with animals like us, that's sort of, that's part of it.
And is it a goal that they are aware of? And do they feel good when the goal is achieved and bad when the goal is not? Or is it a goal that is evolutionary framed in the way that, the thermostat has a goal of achieving the desired temperature? So that's what I'm getting at with sentience. It's distinct from goal setting. It's distinct from sense and respond. Is this capacity to feel and to actually have an experience, whatever that means, right? Whatever that really is.
Yeah. Well, there might be like degrees of that. So
I
I
think
know
you're
with
right. Yeah.
plants, yeah. So I know with plants, it's like, I honestly don't know what is a good definition of, say, something like intelligence. And I'm not sure if everybody has even agreed. So I'm going to put that, something like that away. But then there's like other ones like memory and learning. Like self-awareness. You're kind of climbing up on this ladder. Well, I shouldn't say it like that because I don't want to make it to sound like we're on the top of the ladder. But there's different degrees. And I know that there are people interested, like scientists interested in using very sort of strict frameworks. So the person I'm thinking about, his name is J.C. Cahill. He's a colleague of mine. He works here at University of Alberta. He's really interested in this idea of plant behavior. But he's keenly aware that it's super controversial and so a lot of the experiments that have done in this topic have never been replicated. It's kind of a little bit like the Wood Wide Web in terms of we got to go back and assess the experiments before we can even think about having these big discussions of are trees sharing resources and recognized kin. Some of the experiments, they need to be redone. Some of the experiments have never even been done. So, so there's a question just sort of in the trenches of what's happening.
And the dynamic feels very similar to me with the Wood Wide Web. And I don't know where the conclusion will lie. But again, it seems like, there is some interesting science. There's a real pull from science journalists and people writing books and the public at large for yet more narrative gold, right? To seize on this as an amazing, mind-blowing story. And there's similar dangers because there's dangers of one, the hype just taking it in one direction. But there's also a danger of people reacting against that in a knee-jerk negative way that just shuts all the research down and just don't be ridiculous. And so I think what you're explaining is that basically your colleague is, in a way, I think, trying to do the process that you've gone through with the Wood Wide Web. Is that analogous with that sort of sober, calm review?
Yes, starting from the beginning and then getting agreement in the research community. What would it look like for a plant that is learning, that is memory? What does it look like in experiments, say with animals, that we are more comfortable with saying they can learn and remember things? But what do those experiments look like? Can we and we agree that when you do this experiment and there's this outcome, that's a demonstration of learning. Can we then use those experiments that we've all agreed on ahead of time in terms of what the outcomes mean, and then use them on plants? And then what's the outcome? And then obviously not be super attached to any outcome. And that's sort of where he's trying to take that field. And I think that is great because, it still allows that open-mindedness, but it adds that rigor of we all agreed, this is our gold standard experiment. When you do this, this is the interpretation. We're going to apply that gold standard experiment now to species that are, very sort of unconventional, but we're just going to see what happens. And I think that's the way to do it.
I completely agree here. And there's so much fascinating. I mean, to be honest, even in the animal domain, it's very immature, right? The concept of understanding welfare and quantifying welfare, thinking about how many dimensions it might have, how it might scale, and how it varies across different species. But there's already some brilliant work being done that you mentioned there by people like Bob Fisher and Jonathan Birch and others who are thinking about the variety of animal sentience for a bunch of different reasons, policy reasons, charity choice, priority reasons, welfare concern and intervention reasons. There's also different reasons why we might want to know whether a black fly or a salmon or a pig or a human, has different degrees of sentience or different types of sentience. And I actually suggested to Bob recently in private correspondence of when you do these tables and these charts, and they're super humble about it. And they're like, look, the research is patchy, uncertainty is high, we don't know. Hopefully, the further research that's done will be done in a compassionate, non-interventionist way rather than by hurting the beings we're trying to understand. But I've almost suggested, well, it would be really interesting to just put a plant in there, right? Put a soybean plant in there as a comparator. And that's partly because of selfish vegan reasons, because I want to make sure that when people are thinking, let's compare different types of animal welfare, they're not just deciding which type of animal should we exploit and kill. Because often that is the way people tend to think. They assume that animal agriculture must continue. It's just, what tweaks should we make to it? And I think including a soybean plant would be interesting because when you do the welfare comparison, I'm pretty confident it won't score anywhere near as highly as the animals we farm today. And it presents a pragmatic alternative that we should switch to. Anyway, that's my vegan agenda. But I also think we should do it for the reasons you were laying out of just good science and intellectual curiosity. And if we're using ideas like analgesics or moving away from pain stimulus or the ability to do unlimited associative learning or, whatever these indicators might be, well, yeah, let's expose them to plants. And maybe we'll find that a Venus flytrap scores slightly more highly than, a soybean or, who knows, but yeah.
Yeah. So, I think it's it's a really interesting topic. And
Luna is definitely sentient, by the way, aren't you?
Okay. Luna,
a very high credence.
I bet. The other thing too, I was thinking in all of this though, is I think it's a slippery slope to look to nature as examples for our morality and ethics.
Yes.
Because
absolutely.
I'm sorry, there's all sorts of things happening out there that I accept it happens out there, but I don't want to emulate it in society.
Absolutely. It's I think of nature as being completely amoral.
Yeah, it's
nearly everything dies, right? That's how evolution works, right? It's not a good guide to anything moral at all. Hence my preferred basis is something to do with compassion and justice and moral consideration and care for each other, right? And care for all sentient beings.
Yeah. And so these ethical discussions that, we have the capacity to have and think about and weigh different factors, that's definitely in the human realm. And that is something, that's where I think we should focus. And like I said, it's just, there is stuff out there that it's no, we don't want to have that in our society. And then plus, and I'm just so skeptical of when people see what they want in nature, because, as I explained sort of with my example of I'm in the ocean, I'm in the grasslands, I'm in the forest, it's just all projected feelings. And so, we see what we want or don't want in nature. So I think you kind of just got to let it be. And then instead focus on these, ethical frameworks of how do we want to live together? What's important? All the questions you're talking about, Jamie, who matters? Why? We are totally capable. These are really difficult conversations, I think, but they're important. And I think that's where our time and energy should be. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Now, this is really unfair to do, given we've only got a few minutes left. I could talk to you all day. But the final big question is, how do we make a better world?
I knew you were going to ask me that, and I've been sweating over this question for weeks. And I'll tell you why. It's so overwhelming. How do we make a better world? And then, and I was should I do some research on this? What do I do? So, and then finally I had to like stop agonizing about it and then ask myself, like, why is this question wigging me out so much? Because it's the weight of responsibility of like, and I am not someone who generally finds any joy in telling someone else how to live. Like, I am much more of like, let's unpack this together and see if we can find a space for each other, or if we could figure this out together. And, maybe me move apart in that conversation, maybe we move together. I don't know.
Well, that sounds like part of the answer.
I know. And so then what I finally came down to is like, well, I think a better world would be when we are better versions of ourselves. And I guess the better version of myself might be different than the better version of yourself. And, like it's a very sort of personal thing. But for me, my better version involves like freedom to be creative, freedom to learn, freedom to be curious. And I guess that's what I settled at, is I could only tell you how I could maybe be a better version of myself towards that better world. That's as far as I could get. So
I like it. And I think if we could get all the other 8 billion humans to take the same approach, then maybe we are on our way to some sort of more utopian future, or at the very least, some more sort of positive role that humanity could play in wider sentientity.
yeah.
Who knows? And do you have any sense about the role that science and science communication and the types of things we've been talking about here, and I guess also maybe public epistemology can play in that? Because we're always living in strange times, but particularly what's going on politically in some parts of the world at the moment, we do have dynamics where, misinformation, disinformation and conspiracism seem to have the upper hand, where we're not just having, narratives drawing people forward, we're having people with agendas driving a narrative, and industries with an agendas driving a narrative deliberately, and sometimes scientists being complicit in that
part
exercise,
of it.
and other people turning away from science completely because of whatever reason, right? They've been told not to trust it, or they've given up.
Yeah, no, and as I think I mentioned, like that is greatly concerning to me. And I think there's a couple things, and so much of what you're talking about boils down to like trusting one another, trusting institutions, and I think that has been eroded. And I think, so as a scientist, I reflect on my role in that. There's a couple things like, so if someone tells you science says we should do this in response to like a normative question, I would definitely kind of walk back. Like that to me is a red flag, because that person is totally dismissing or ignoring the importance of values. Science takes us so far. Science, we're really good at addressing positive questions. How many trees are there in the forest? What happens when we cut them down? Those sorts of positive questions. But this is my personal opinion, I don't think science has any role in determining values. We cannot weigh in on values. That is not the space for science. And science becomes, the small s to a big S when we start to move into that space. And so as scientists, like, I think that we have to seed that space when we know that we're starting to intersect with people's values. Like, and that's when it becomes important to like, sort of the old things that's like compromise, negotiate, barter, whatever it is, because no more data is going to address the problem. It's a question of values. And I think, and again, this is just all my opinion, is that scientists have crept too far into that value space. And, the Wood Wide Web is sort of an example of that, of just like, scientists, it's like, we love forests and everything. And so we were kind of willing to let the truth slide because it was this noble goal. And that is a place of values. And, and then the Wood Wide Web got this stamp of approval from capital S science. And that is not the right place for us. And so, it's recognizing as a scientist, like, here's what we can contribute to policy. Here's what we contribute to environmental goals, conservation, like, some of these larger these big conversations. But ultimately, we contribute through data and like, well, here's what we know about the system right now. Here's what we don't know. But ultimately, like these questions of, do we conserve forests? How do we value forests? That is not a space for science. That is a space that is based on values. And I think, for me, part of regaining the trust in public is backing off those spaces. I think that we've been, too aggressive. And it's really important to recognize, like, someone walks into a forest and they're just like, damn, this place makes me feel good. That's important.
Yeah.
That's important.
That's their sentient experience, right? That's wonderful. Yeah. It matters.
Yeah. And, I don't think it needs to be backed up by, and there's 1,000 species in this forest and this much carbon sequestration. Like, they're two totally different things. And that person's feeling of just like, I want this forest to be here for my kids, my grandkids. It makes me feel good. I think it's going to make them feel good. Like, that is part of these discussions, and it needs to be. And yeah, so I think it's recognizing that is really important.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you so much. And I think what you've explained and the role you've played through this story is an example of what that type of good science should be doing. Right? It's not being captured by a narrative, or if you are captured by one, you work that out, and then you will work to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it's uncomfortable or if it's contentious. But I think the other really important thing is just this combination of humility, being very comfortable, even as an expert, saying, I don't know, we don't know, we're uncertain, but maintaining the curiosity to try and dig deeper and find out and follow the evidence where it leads. And I think that's what we need more of, right? We don't want a dogmatic science or a values-led science. We need...
No. And importantly, it's also saying, I was wrong, right? Like, there's uncertainty, and it's, yes, we need to recognize that. But then it's also, when it comes to that place of like, I was wrong in how I understood this particular system. I've seen the new data. I've looked at it. I've thought about it. I've had time to reflect. I am updating my knowledge of this system now. And that's okay. And I think people need to hear why that happens. Because the flip side, sometimes the public can be like, oh, those scientists are changing their minds every day. And so we don't want to come across as just flippant. But yeah, it's having that humility and being humble in what we know, and not overstepping and becoming like a technocratic society. I think we need to avoid that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a path to rebuilding that trust. Yeah. The answer to flawed science is just keep trying to do it better. So, yeah. Well, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. And like you say, those sort of twin stories of the Wood Wide Web and maybe also the plant sentience thing, I think are really instructive examples of how values and epistemology could sometimes warp and influence each other in sometimes helpful ways and sometimes not. So it was fascinating to walk through those with you. Thank you. What's the best way of people following you, keeping up to date with your research? I don't know how much social media you do, whether you're into that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I am on Twitter, but I got to say, I kind of abandoned that account. I went over to Blue Sky.
Yeah, me too. I'm on both, but...
Yeah, I just got tired of the ads and the crappy algorithm on Twitter. So I have moved to Blue Sky.
And
so
Elon forcing his tweets into your face every minute of every day.
I just can't take it. So,
I mean, it's a tangent, right? But that platform almost now seems to be a deliberate attempt to destroy public epistemology and ethics. I mean, it's almost like the antithesis of what I'm trying to do with this worldview. So.
I know. No, it's not.
Oh, well.
Yeah, it's not.
Anyway, sorry, you're on Blue Sky.
Yeah. So I'm on Blue Sky. But, I'm always happy. Like, people have emailed me after these podcasts. I'm happy to chat with people over email. The lab has a website. You can check out our research there. But mostly like I'm, happy to keep having these conversations. I find them really fascinating. Like one of the really positive outcomes of the downfall of the Wood Wide Web is just all the really interesting conversations, like where it's taken me and just, how it intersects on different topics. Like I have, had to wrestle with ideas and questions and new ideas. And so, and even on your podcast, there were some questions like I don't have answers to. And I realized that, I need to think about that a little bit more. Like, where am I in this space? Like, Jamie's got it all figured out, but like,
I don't know about that,
but like, where do I fall? What do I think about this? But I look forward to those spaces of, where I recognize it's time to reflect and think about this. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, I'd love to carry on the conversation in public or in private, and maybe one day we can sign you up as a committed sentientist. But thank you so much for being a guest on Sentientism today. It's been a real pleasure, Justine.
Yeah, thank you. Don't drink too much more coffee now.
Yeah, it is getting later now. Yeah. All right. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Jamie.